Test 5.
Okay, we need a special topics 2 test 5. We're going to start with that one and then we're going to roll into the heating and AC test 7. All right. All right, you got that? All right, now let's do this. Special topics 2 test 5. All of the following statements are true except A, the magnetic lines of force leave the South Pole and enter the North Pole. B, magnetic lines of force never intersect. C, around every conductor carrying current is a magnetic field. Or D, the higher the current through a conductor, the stronger the magnetic flux.
A.
A is the one that's wrong. All right, you got that? Okay, now then, number 2, technician A says some DC motors use brushes. Technician B says an AC synchronous motor uses a permanent magnet rotor. Who is correct about that? Both of those guys are right. You know, the electric motor that on the Honda Insight is actually sandwiched in between the engine and the transaxle. It works really smooth the way that they do that one, but the batteries are really not much good on those cars, or they didn't used to be. They may be better now. Technician A says, excuse me, back up. The power of most electric motors is expressed in what? Kilowatts, amps, watts, or horsepower?
Amps.
Kilowatts.
Dang.
Okay, AC synchronous motors used in hybrid electric vehicles use how many windings in the stationary part of the motor?
4.
3. You basically have 3 big leads coming from the inverter going to the motor on the transaxle, and that's what gives you your and you know the power that's coming out of that battery has got to be changed to AC current in order to operate that motor. And the motor's got a resolver on it that you know, provides input to that inverter so that it can work right like that. That's pretty stuff's happening really fast with those transistors and stuff if you get to thinking about how that thing operates. Technician A says a traction motor used in a hybrid vehicle is controlled by varying the voltage to the motor. Technician B says the frequency of the current is controlled. Which technician is correct? Both of those guys are right. Both of those guys are right. It's actually varying the voltage and the frequency. You have to if you're doing AC, right? No two ways about it. Technician A says DC to DC converter is used to convert 12 volts from the battery to higher voltage to run the engine electric motors in a hybrid electric vehicle. Does he sound right?
Yes.
He is a yo-yo. Technician B says a DC to DC converter is used to convert the voltage from the motor generator to a higher voltage to charge the high voltage batteries. Who's correct about that? That would be, which one?
D.
D. See, listen to that. What type of electric motor is used for the traction motor in hybrid electric vehicles? Both B and C, a DC brush type motor and a brushless DC motor. All right. The blank are used to rectify AC to DC current.
Transistors.
Diodes, that's always the way you use that. Diodes are basically put together in a rectifier. 8, number 8, you're going to have the, number 9. What's the most common type of motor used as in an AC, the most common type of a rotor used in an AC synchronous motor? Your textbook will really help you understand this stuff. You dig into it. Permanent magnet, that's what it is on there. Has anybody handled any permanent magnet motors today? Starter. You handled one, but you didn't put it on yet, right? The starter.
I thought you said that last.
That's why those permanent magnets are ceramic, and you don't need to whack one of those starters too hard. You can crack one of the magnets in it, see? Current sensors are commonly used by the motor controller to help with the tasks of motor management. What type of sensor is used for this task?
Hall effect.
Hall effect. Technician A says a broken magnet becomes 2 magnets. Technician B says there's a strong relationship between magnetism and electricity. Which technician is correct?
Both.
If I wanted a magnet and I didn't want it to be magnetic anymore, if I had one and I wanted to destroy the magnetism where it wouldn't be magnetic anymore, what would I do?
Coat it with.
You'd have to heat it up. If you heat it really hot and let it cool down, the magnetism goes away.
That's weird.
Yeah. Now I don't know if one of those ceramic magnets would do that or not, but if you've got a metal piece of metal as a magnet, like in my little thing here, if you heat it up really hot with a torch and then let it cool off, the magnetism will be gone. Let me see. Induced voltages may be created by doing what?
All of these. And it says increased by.
All of these are correct. Increase the speed the conductors pass through the flux field, increase the number of conductors, increase the strength of the magnetic field. There you go. basically, you know, if I took a piece of wire here and I wrapped it around and around and around, this wire right here, this pretty reddish colored wire that you see in these motors, is not touching itself. It's covered with shellac.
Found that out the hard way.
Yeah, and so if you just wrap naked wire like this, it's going to just create a huge short and burn something up. But this right here, the current that's going from this brush all the way through that motor to the other brush is traveling through all of these windings. You see, that's what the deal is on that. So if I actually took this winding apart and I roll this into a long loop and I hooked a meter onto it and I ran a magnet through there, I could see voltage being created by the magnetism sweeping across this copper. The more windings you have, that's what ignition coil does. You got some windings that are sort of coarse, then you got some super fine windings that are finer than thread. I mean, they are really, really, really fine, just like zillions of rounds of those windings. And whenever you saturate that magnetic field on that primary winding, which is the bigger one, the fewer one, and then you collapse it, it actually causes a spark to be generated in that secondary winding and jumps out. One of the first electric motors was made, an induced current moves so that its magnetic field opposes the motion that induced the current. This principle is called what?
Ohm's law?
Haldeman's law.
Lenz's law.
I was close.
Yeah. Haldeman's law is Haldeman's the guy that wrote the book. Okay. One of the first electric motors was made by the inventor who?
Faraday.
Really?
It was Edison, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't Edison.
It was Faraday.
It was Tesla.
No, it was Faraday.
It was Tesla.
Yeah, Faraday.
Tesla made the most awesome electric motor.
Oh, you saw whenever on Murdoch Mysteries when he met that Tesla guy, didn't you? Okay, well, you must have. I thought so. Technician A says the speed of a DC motor is proportional to the applied current. Technician B says the torque of a DC motor is proportional to the applied voltage. Who's right about that? Neither one of those guys are right. Number 2 or false? All electric motors must use direct current.
False.
That comes under the heading of hogwash. The next one, true, false. All electric motors must use brushes.
False.
False. You can have brushless motors. Matter of fact, some of these hybrid motors on these cars, most of them are brushless. There's a little water pump motor, a little plastic water pump motor on some of these hybrid vehicles that fails all the time. And it's 12 volt, but it's brushless AC. So you can't take one of these 12 volt water pump motors and hook it up to a battery and see it spin, because it won't happen. It actually runs on AC current, from that hybrid circuitry. Number 18, Technician A says there are 9 or more electric motors in electric hybrid vehicles. Technician B says many of these motors use an electronic module to control their operation. Who's correct? Both those guys are right. How many electric motors does your car have in it? What can you think of? Give me 3.
Fuel pump,
Fuel pump's 1, that's a good answer.
air compressor,
No, it's not an electric motor.
Windows.
Hmm?
Windows.
Windows, starter, power seats, power mirrors. I mean, think about how many electric motors there are doing work for us on our little cars here.
Mine has maybe 1.
Yeah. Yours has got a wiper motor and a starter motor. So.
What about motor and windows?
Yeah. What term describes the ability of an object or surface to store an electric charge? What would you call that? Capacitance. Brushless permanent magnet motors use what kind of rotors?
Brushless.
Well, they usually use both A and B. Interior permanent magnets or surface permanent magnets? Obviously. Neither A or B can't be right. What term describes how easily a magnetic field passes through a barrier?
Permeability.
Permeability is a good answer for that. Think about a semi-permeable membrane on a cell. A coil of wire has electrical current flowing through it. Technician A says you can increase the magnetism of this coil by increasing the number of coils in the wire.
Yes.
Technician B says you can increase the magnetism of this coil by increasing the current flowing through it. Who's correct about that? Both of those guys are right. 23. We're moving with blazing speed here, so you guys don't miss anything. If I'm going too fast for you, don't worry. It's all in the book. Okay. Magnetic field is moved past the stationary coil of wire at a 90-degree angle. Electrical current is generated in the wire. What is the term that describes this?
Induction.
Induction. A typical DC motor today uses how many poles?
Eight.
4 poles. It uses 4. Technician A says all electric motors are DC motors. Technician B says 2 types of brushless motors use AC current. Who's correct about that?
B.
B. You know the little computer fans that you got in your computers, the little fans? Those are 12 volt brushless DC electric motors. All right, let me see here. Let me see. What number am I on? I forgot.
26.
In this diagram, the atom indicated by the arrow is called what? Ding, ding,
Capacitor.
ding, ding,
It's
ding.
a transistor, isn't it?
I'd say it's a transistor.
What do you guys think?
Looks like the flux
I think it's a transistor because transistors have 3 legs, don't they?
Look at what's going on here, though.
It's got a ground, it's got a 14 volt input, then it changes it somehow to whatever A is.
AC to DC.
Believe it or not, it's a DC to DC converter.
Everything else.
Think about it. It's changing 14 volts to 5 volts. All of it's DC. That's a DC to DC converter, guys. Okay. Ford and Toyota hybrid drive motors use what type of rotor? Interior permanent magnets. The windings on the what we were told when I went to hybrid vehicle school, the windings in Toyota and Ford vehicles are handmade. I mean, they're actually hand wound in a third world country somewhere. And if you look at them, they are, I'm serious, in a third world country. And they look like they're hand wound. If you look at them, they actually look that way. Let me see here. In a synchronous AC motor, the speed of the motor is controlled by changing the what in the stator? Frequency. We talked about that earlier. Electric power steering uses an electric motor mounted where? Either A or B, either on the steering column or on the rack. On a Chevy Cobalt, you're going to find a big, almost looks like a wiper motor mounted just below where you can see, like, you know, the knee bolster and all. If you pull the knee bolster, you'll look up and you'll see that motor and its module and all that stuff. All right, 30 capacitors are checked for voltage using what? A Cat 3 digital voltmeter.
Those things can
No.
store all kinds of voltage.
Yeah, number 31. I've got a Cat 3 in there on my desk. It's a little brown one. Did you see it? You can buy a Cat 3 meter a lot of times at a pawn shop for not much money. That one I've got, you can hold it close to a socket, and if it's got power, it lights up red. Just hold it pointed at it, you know. In this schematic, what is the purpose of the rear motor? What is the purpose of the rear motor in this schematic? I want you to look at it.
Operates the rear.
Notice every motor has got its own inverter. Isn't that interesting? You got your high voltage battery out there that's illustrated with nothing but a couple of lines that aren't quite touching each other. 288 volts coming out of that battery, going through a filter capacitor and an inductor. It got some transistors there. You got your main capacitor on the other side. Those are the ones that have to bleed off. 650 volts coming out of those inverters.
Let's see.
Are you guys totally stymied by that one?
Yep.
Provides 4-wheel drive.
How would you know this?
Hmm?
How would you know that?
Would it be all-wheel drive?
What is the on this particular vehicle here on the Toyotas? You've got actually 2 motors in the transaxle, and if you're going to have 4-wheel drive, you got to have another motor driving the other axle. And this is basically what you'd see on a Toyota Highlander or something like that, right? Number 32. Write T if the statement is true and false if the statement is false. Have you written it yet? The hybrid system control unit is air-cooled.
False.
Write your answer in the space provided. What is an inverter?
An inverter.
What did I tell you? You got 3 wires going to each one of those motors up there. Look at that thing up there on your power control unit. Okay, the inverter is actually, what kind of voltage do we have coming out of the high voltage battery?
288.
We got DC. What's necessary to drive those motors?
AC.
AC. Okay, now tell me what an inverter is, because each one of those motors has got an inverter.
Converts DC to AC.
Converts DC to AC. You guys are a lot smarter than you look, you know that.
Now,
I was
is it a
just
converter that changes from AC to DC?
DC to DC converter changes. I mean, there's a DC to DC converter that
DC.
takes the it does other things, but the primary thing that I remember that one does is it takes this high voltage coming out of your main battery and it feeds it to the 12 volt so that it can keep it at 14.5. So you don't have an alternator on these cars. It actually uses the hybrid vehicle technology and all that. Okay, that finished that one.